evaluating the legacy of Christopher Lasch's Culture of Narcissism. And we have 3 panelists, and I will say a word or two about each of them, and then they will get started. So, Elizabeth Lunbeck is at the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University, which is where she graduated. And she has written a book called The Psychiatric Persuasion, which was about the psychiatric profession, how it altered from being more concerned with treating people in hospitals. And so it was early on in the 20th century. She's also co-written a book with Bennett Simon on the American, I'm going to get this right. The Family Romance, Family Secrets, a case study from the American Psychoanalyst in 1912. And then she's also written The Americanization of Narcissism, which got a great deal of attention when it came out a few years ago. And she may be writing more on that subject. And we're very pleased to have her. Next is Natasha Zaretsky, who's an associate professor at Southern Illinois University. And she wrote a book that also covered some of Christopher Lasch called No Direction Home, The American Family and the Fear of National Decline, 1968-1980. And early next year, she's going to have a book coming out on, I wrote this last night and I can't read my own writing. So it reminds me of Woody Allen's first movie, where he was a bank robber. And he went in to rob a bank, and he gave the note, and the teller could not decide what the note said. And he said, it says, I have a gun, give me your money. And she was saying, go. That it said go. So anyway, Natasha has a book coming out next year from Columbia University Press on the 3 Mile Island. And that should be very interesting to read. Dagmar Herzog is a distinguished professor at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and she has written a number of books, one of which is on sale here, and it's called Cold War Freud. And so this is where there's an overlap between what everybody is writing. But she has also written Sexuality in Europe, a 20th Century History, Sex and Crisis, The New Sexual Revolution, and the Future of American Politics, which came out in 2008, Sex After Fascism, Memory and Morality in 20th Century Germany, and Intimacy and Exclusion on Religious Politics in Pre-Revolutionary Battle. Anyway, this should be a very interesting panel, and they're going to speak in the order that they're sitting, and then we'll have discussion afterwards. So I want to say that we will have discussion afterwards. So hold your questions or comments till everybody is done. And the other thing is, if you have a cell phone that's on, give it to me and I can sell it. Please turn it off. Okay. Please turn it off. Okay.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me? Do I need the microphone? Hold on. So I'm talking about narcissism in the age of Trump. The long-standing question of whether Trump is a narcissist has, over the course of the last several months, become ever more urgent. It has spawned countless news articles, a number of them invoking Christopher Lasch's landmark Culture of Narcissism, as well as a raft of amateur diagnosticians who confidently assert that he is. Grandiose, entitled, arrogant, and hungry for admiration, Trump appears to many to be the very embodiment of the malignant narcissist, a world-class exemplar of this miserable personality type, the greatest narcissistic president God ever created. He has long envisioned himself a king, a ruler of the world, according to second wife Marla Maples, and now he actually is. Though whether he is more George III, that's MSNBC and the New Republic, than Henry VIII, that's The Economist and Newsweek, is an open question. Reports coming out of the White House suggest that it's gone full Tudor court, with rampant backstabbing, treachery, and organized paranoia, even if Steve Bannon's dream of himself as latter-day Thomas Cromwell to Trump's Henry appears unlikely to be realized. Still, the point is made. Trump's need to dominate and his habit of attacking anyone and anything that gets in his way, from the Prime Minister of Montenegro to the media, are striking. As is his surrounding himself with yes-men courtiers who tell him what they think will keep him happy, to the extent of sprinkling his name throughout the intelligence memos they put before him, all in the interest of keeping him reading. At this point, I put my money on the Tudor over the Hanoverian, and not only because I think that focusing on his character is unlikely to result in his impeachment. And yet, Trump is not a monarch, but a democratically elected president. Even acknowledging that he lost the popular vote, that a foreign power appears to have interfered in the election, that an American public servant interfered in the election, that a candidate other than Clinton might have trounced him, whether Bernie or Joe Biden, at least by Biden's own telling, we have to come to terms with the fact that a staggering 63 million American citizens voted for the man. He did not come to the throne by reason of his father's death, but by reason of the 63 million. This presents a problem with which commentators of all stripes have been wrestling since November. How did this man with no political experience, who was roundly judged to be utterly unfit to hold office, manage to appeal to a broad enough swath of the American populace to win the presidency in 2016? And why have a goodly proportion of his supporters struck with him, driven not just by expediency, though certainly expediency is in play, but more interestingly by what is by all accounts an utterly implacable, unperturbable belief in him and in what he represents. Here today I'll look at the question through the lens of narcissism. I'll argue that Trump mobilizes his own narcissism, evident in his charisma and grandiosity, as well as in a primitive inner world characterized by rage and envy. He mobilizes this to connect to his followers and to effect their willing submission to him. The bonds he has forged with his followers have yielded him a constant stream of adulation, and has in turn held out to his loyal, and he has in turn held out to his loyal enthusiasts the promise of participating in his greatness. The deal struck many of the nations disenfranchised and aggrieved have sworn allegiance to this larger-than-life figure, who they feel understands them and their struggles. They have been unfazed by his performance in office, notably his occupying rather than draining the Washington swamp, and they continue to declare their unwavering support of him to puzzled print and television journalists. Further, I'll argue that Lasch's Culture of Narcissism and what it wrought can't help us understand this. Lasch and narcissism have been long inextricably linked in the popular conversation about the nation's character since the 1970s. Now Trump has been added to the mix, with commentators turning to Lasch as they attempt to comprehend the president's personality. The problem is that this narcissism of the public conversation, and even the narcissism of the DSM, is wholly focused on the condition's liabilities, to the exclusion of any of its upsides. It's these upsides that have been missing from the conversation and that hold the key, I'd suggest, to making any sense of Trump's character and what it means for us, and more especially for his followers. So then you may ask, what in the world has Lasch got to do with any of this? Although The Culture of Narcissism was published in 1978, more than 4 decades ago, I'd argue this book has a lot to do with it. And let me explain here. I'll be summarizing because I've written about this in part in my book that was just mentioned. Lasch was among a small number of brilliant cultural critics writing in the 1970s, including Daniel Bell and Philip Reif, building on the insights of an earlier generation of critics, most notably David Reisman, author of 1950 of The Lonely Crowd, who issued dire assessments of the state of the nation, charting its decline in tandem with individualism's rise. It was Lasch's particular genius to marshal the clinical term narcissism for cultural critique. Seriously engaged with psychoanalytic thinking, he cloaked his own preoccupations with the ascendancy of consumption over production and with the feminization of culture in a clinical idiom, playing on the chattering class's aspirations to fluency in this beguiling lingua franca. Lasch was writing at a time when intellectuals' critiques of consumption had reached an apogee, and in knitting together the cultural and the clinical, he, and this is really critical, was relentlessly focused on the hedonism of his narcissistic subject, the unwarranted gratifications this person enjoyed. He analogized the analyst's objects, inner representations and experiences of other people, and the cultural critic's objects, things bought in the capitalist marketplace, to mount an argument for asceticism as the remedy for the disease he and his fellow critics diagnosed. Hedonism, instant gratification, lonely, emptied, and bored selves, all of which he put under the rubric narcissism. And he altogether overlooked the half of the clinical conversation about narcissism that focused on its healthy, and even in analyst eyes, necessary dimensions. Lasch's construal of narcissism was taken up by just about everyone participating in the non-clinical conversation about the condition, a term used variously as an epithet, a highfalutin synonym for selfishness, and in the last decade it is an indictment of an entire generation, the millennials, purportedly the most narcissistic generation in history. This agenda setting on Lasch's part testifies to the magnitude of his achievement. His book is still widely discussed and considered newly relevant. It's commonly asserted, for example, that we live in a culture of narcissism. Yet this is also not without its problems. I would argue that it's related to the situation in which we now find ourselves when trying to understand the phenomenon of Trump, namely, that our concepts and categories are proving inadequate to the task. This is in part because narcissism has been deployed so promiscuously, slapped onto shopaholic young women, as well as onto destructive CEOs. Like, what other rubric could encompass these two categories of personhood? It's been used so promiscuously and with such a negative tint that we have a hard time using it to explain success of the sort Trump is enjoying. Added to the popular conversation, psychiatry's turn to the DSM, which favors surface description over plumbing the inner life, and we can begin to see the problem. Consider the ways that even experts have been stumped by Trump. Some argue that labeling him a narcissist offends not only ethical precepts prohibiting diagnosing at a distance, but also common clinical sense. Sure, he looks and acts like a narcissist, but he's not suffering and not impaired. After all, as he's reminded us, he's the president and we're not. Distress is a key criterion in diagnosing personality disorder, according to the DSM, and these clinicians argue, while we might be feeling it, Trump certainly is not. Thus, however much he looks like the stock narcissist, we'd be wrong to label him as such. This is not my position. This is the Goldwater Rule clinician's position. Their reasoning varies. Psychiatrist Alan Francis, who wrote the DSM criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, argues that Trump does not suffer from the distress and impairment required to diagnose mental disorder. Psychologist Keith Campbell, who in his co-authored 2010 bestseller, The Narcissism Epidemic, blithely brands an entire generation of millennials as selfish, entitled, navel-gazing narcissists, demurs when it comes to the celebrity-obsessed billionaire president on the grounds that, quote, he's functioning pretty highly. A layperson consulting the DSM, and I have to say here that this is, the APA has created the conditions for this by marketing and profiting off the DSM. A layperson might readily surmise that Trump's behavior and temperament conform to psychiatric descriptions of pathological narcissism. More than a few articles have presented the DSM's 9 criteria for the diagnosis, side-by-side examples drawn from Trump's actions, speeches, and Twitter feed. The exercise is almost too easy, especially given Trump's extensive record of grandiose self-assessments. His preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success and power, his interpersonal exploitativeness, his convictions that others envy him, and his lack of empathy are readily grasped. By these DSM criteria, Trump is a living, breathing textbook of character disorder, meeting just about every criterion in the literal book. The problem for us is that the DSM narcissist is an altogether repugnant character. Reference to it can't help us understand why anyone, let alone those 63 million voters, would be drawn to such a person. Grandiose, entitled, devaluing, boasting, exploitative. What's the attraction here? The DSM's narcissistic personality disorder can account for why people might fear Trump and his vindictiveness, the negatives of his character, but cannot explain why anyone would flock to him with the sort of abject devotion one can see in some of his followers, the positive, appealing aspects of his character. Nearly everyone commenting on Trump's alleged narcissism, the press, clinicians, political commentators, has focused almost entirely on the downsides of his narcissism. A focus on narcissism's disability leaves a lot of what's most useful about the category on the table. It's a remarkably protean concept. In clinicians' hands, it refers to a broad range of behaviors and dispositions, encompassing traits both desirable, such as ambition, self-confidence, and despicable, such as ruthlessness and grandiosity. To psychoanalysts in particular, narcissism also refers to a neutral quantity of self-feeling, akin to self-esteem, as well as, very confusingly, a seriously disturbed yet often high-functioning type of person. It's a confusing and difficult mix. Yet everyone's an expert on narcissism in an age where a Google search of the term will yield you 10 million hits, when you can take a 20-question test, the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, that promises to gauge your narcissism, and when you can play amateur psychiatrist, tallying Trump's symptoms alongside the DSM checklist. Everyone may be an expert, but all this expertise, including that found in the DSM, can't explain Trump's appeal. All the many construals of narcissistic personality disorder fall into two basic categories. One organized around checklists and descriptions of the narcissist's unappealing behavior and traits. The other organized around paradox, encompassing those traits, while at the same time giving the narcissist appeal its due. The charisma and charm that enable them to extract from adoring acolytes the admiration that sustains their sense of self. You won't find this narcissist in the DSM. Then again, psychiatry and the DSM don't own narcissism. To understand Trump's drawing power, we must turn to narcissism organized around paradoxes. These paradoxes that many of us find difficult to grasp in the actual person in the flesh of the narcissist, chiefly between his charming, glittery presentation on the one hand and his absolute ruthlessness on the other. Between his apparent love for others on the one hand, I love the poorly educated, I love the vets, I love women, and his casual contempt on the other. For example, not attending a single Veterans Day event, talking about women as little more than objects to be exploited, recall his I moved on her like a bitch. And we must take account of the narcissist's sometimes considerable charisma and examine the nature of the relationship between leader and led. What is at issue is not so much the narcissistic leader's personality, but rather the ways he mobilizes that personality to connect with his followers. And for the analysts among you, the sort of narcissism I'm talking about, I think is best laid out by Kernberg in his 1975 book on borderline conditions and narcissism. Many studies of leadership start from the premise that a successful leader will be by definition narcissistic, visionary and charismatic on the one hand, and ruthless in pursuit of his own aims on the other. It's a near truism in these studies that only those with ambition, high self-esteem, and deep reservoirs of narcissism tend to reach positions of leadership. The figure of the narcissistic leader who skillfully deploys his personal magnetism to bind slavishly adoring subordinates to his person, while at the same time devaluing, even psychologically brutalizing them, is a central player in the studies of leadership and management. This leader appears gloriously self-sufficient, but is at bottom hungry for praise and adoration. He creates the illusion he loves his followers, but in fact turns to them only for tribute and adoration. This narcissistic / psychopathic leader has been normalized over the past decade, with his traits championed as adaptive and even necessary. Researchers have found, for example, that traits linked to insufficient impulse control, which Trump has many, are either unrelated or negatively related to leadership performance, but that fearless dominance of the sort Trump displays, his physical and interpersonal boldness, is associated with agenda setting and persuasiveness. There are, of course, no leaders without followers, and it is Trump's gift to make others feel that he values them, even as he, during the campaign, flew around the country in his own 757 and sat atop Fifth Avenue in his own little Versailles. Charismatic leaders excel at apprehending and even exploiting the often unarticulated needs of those they would dominate, and we can see in this something of Trump's success. Perhaps no narratives were more ubiquitous throughout the campaign than, first, Trump cares about me, and two, he is offensive to be sure, but he's only saying what others think. How then did Trump convince the proverbial little guy that he actually cared about him? We can begin to answer this by looking how Trump invites people to identify with him and to share in his omnipotence and power. His braggadocio and his rule-breaking incite envy among those who have little to boast of and who feel imprisoned in their circumstances. And I'm not just doing armchair psychologizing here. I've read an enormous amount in the press of what Trump supporters say, and these are the kinds of things he said. They don't use the analytic language I'm using, but they certainly support this interpretation. His offer is, of course, illusory. No amount of speechifying will launch the little guy into the economic stratosphere Trump inhabits. But he knows at some level of awareness what he is doing. As he wrote in his The Art of the Deal, I play to people's fantasies. People may not always think big themselves, but they can still get very excited by those who do. That's why a little hyperbole never hurts. People want to believe in something that is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole, and it's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of promotion. Trump projects and promises self-transcendence. One 86-year-old woman from a small town in Pennsylvania told a reporter after the election, I think he touched something inside a lot of people, maybe even something that they didn't know what it was, thus giving voice to the something intangible yet powerful that Trump holds out. Trump and his lifestyle can appear aspirational. It's been said that he's a poor person's idea of a rich person, and that his lifestyle exemplifies beer taste on a champagne budget. He's the proverbial guy in the bar, living the life of fantasized excess many of his white working class voters would want. The ostentatiousness and self-aggrandizement, the gold everywhere, the beauty pageant wife, and the American dream realized by winning the lottery. To left behind white workers in Youngstown, Ohio, he fulfills the longing for the messianic return of a political champion. Trump, who declared at one rally that he was in a certain way a blue-collar worker, plays this part brilliantly with his undisciplined, you only live once style, appearing to one journalist as an avatar of those who are acutely aware of money's evanescence. If Trump has raised the politics of spectacle to a new level, he's also a master at performing intimacy. His engagement with his followers is direct, either at mass events or by way of Twitter, which he's likened to having his own free newspaper. He disdains the media as corrupt and dishonest, skirting them by connecting at all hours with a barrage of tweets, by turns bombastic, hyperbolic, and pugilistic, filled with unsubstantiated claims and outright lies, and expressive of intense negative emotion. In all, as one pundit put it, a thesaurus of gloom. His son, Donald Jr., said, I mean, he's so authentic, adding that the fact that Trump Sr. writes or tweets himself is actually what makes him the great candidate that he is. Trump sees genius in his tweets. I mean, you will read some of the stuff. There is genius there, he said. You have to find the right genius, but it is a powerful thing. I'd say there is genius in this. Trump's apparent authenticity, his apparent lack of the usual filters, is likely at once indicative of his cluelessness and strategic, meant to distract and inflame. His constant rule-breaking is engaging and dramatic and invites his followers' identification with him as a sharer of secrets and speakers of truths that cannot be expressed. Trump's aspirational appeal also lies in the abandon with which he asserts his dominance and the ease with which he inhabits power. He invites others to identify with his aggression and independence of constraining norms. Explaining his bankruptcies, he told one crowd, "You have to use the laws to your advantage. What did I do to that bank? I should get credit for having vision that things were on the decline. I made a lot of money in Atlantic City." Many of his supporters respond favorably to this, seeing in his record of bankruptcies evidence of his independence and dominance. As one middle-aged woman put it, the important thing is he doesn't need their money, that he fulfills a kind of stereotype or characterization of narcissistic independence. Students of narcissism have argued that those attracted to a figure like Trump long for inclusion in the ambit of an almighty personality whose independence of normal human needs for love, appreciation, and encouragement render him godlike, which I agree is pretty apt in this case. In sum, I would argue that if we are going to make sense or make use of the concept of narcissism in understanding Trump, it's worth focusing on the intensity of the connection he has formed with his enthusiasts. Even those who, as one said, know that, quote, Trump doesn't give a shit about me or almost anyone else. This connection has confounded journalists from the beginning of his campaign and continues to do so. Many of Trump's supporters don't care that his relationship with the truth is shaky and opportunistic. They don't care that he trades in anger and hate and that he invited violence against his enemies. They don't care that he has as much as admitted to sexual assault. The difficulty in explaining Trump and his appeal lies in the fact that he's prevailed not despite, but because of all of his lies, anger, contempt toward losers, intolerance of dissent, and bombastic grandiosity. His flouting of just about every political, social, and sexual norm has only enhanced his appeal to his devotees. His narcissism is a resource for, not an impediment to, his continuing success. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, so the title of my talk today is Christopher Lasch and His Critics, the Narcissism Debates in Historical Perspective. I want to begin by thanking the IPA for inviting me to this panel and for giving me the chance to revisit Christopher Lasch's writings on narcissism. It has been over a decade since I have engaged with those writings in any sustained way, although I have been reminded of what Lasch famously called a world of mirrors as I have watched the explosion of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and selfies in our age of social media. And now, with Donald Trump's victory, narcissism is back at the center of public debate. The displacement of politics by spectacle is one symptom of Lasch's culture of narcissism, and it is hard to imagine a more vivid example, a vivid illustration of this than a reality TV star taking over the White House. Meanwhile, mental health professionals debate whether or not Trump fits the profile for narcissistic personality disorder. And in a December 2016 Facebook post that went viral, a person who grew up in a family of NPD sufferers outlined the disorder's features so that others might have a framework for understanding Trump's behavior. This is Narcissism for Dummies, an online survival guide for the Trump era. I am also reminded of the culture of narcissism as reporters and commentators struggled to explain Trump's victory. What has coalesced is a troubling portrait of the contemporary world of the white, rural, poor, and working classes. A hollowed-out, deindustrialized Rust Belt, where the well-paid factory jobs of an earlier era have been replaced by low-wage service work and chronic underemployment. impoverished small towns and rural regions plagued by poverty and opioid addiction, the fraying of familial and mutual support networks, alarmingly high rates of diabetes, drug abuse, and heart disease, and what researchers describe as deaths of despair among the white middle-aged, as those expelled from the labor market succumb to suicide, drugs, and alcoholism, reversing a steady trend of declining mortality rates and longer life expectancies in the United States. This portrait reminds me that Lasch in the late 1970s recognized that the world of the white middle class was becoming increasingly unstable. After all, the subtitle of the Culture of Narcissism was American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations. Despite the tendency to equate narcissism with self-indulgence, Lasch mobilized the psychoanalytic concept of narcissism to portray the American middle class as coming apart at the seams by the late 1970s, or as he put it to his editor at the time, the bourgeoisie at the end of its tether. Lasch's portrait of middle-class precariousness is striking when we consider that he was writing about narcissism as a new neoliberal order was consolidating itself. This was the decade when advanced capitalism underwent a structural mutation in the United States and beyond, as the state-centered Keynesian model of the mid-20th century gave way to a neoliberal reliance on privatization and market remedies. Of course, Lasch did not use the term neoliberalism in the Culture of Narcissism, but his account of an American middle class under siege seems prescient in light of subsequent developments: sharpened economic and social inequality, a decline in collective bargaining rights and job security, and the violent contraction of the U.S. middle class. This is indeed a world of diminishing expectations. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that this structural capitalist transformation also required a thoroughgoing reorganization of the nuclear family. The Keynesian welfare state of the mid-20th century had been organized around the ideal of the family wage, a male breadwinner who earned sufficient wages to support a wife and children. Of course, countless working families, poor families, and families of color were excluded from the family wage bargain, but it remained a powerful normative ideal throughout the 1940s and 1950s. By the late 1960s, however, the family wage was dissolving as women entered the workforce in greater numbers and as the economy transitioned away from heavy industry to service, information, and finance. The consequence was the creation of a dual earner economy in which the vast majority of families would require two people to work for wages outside the home. This economy was more democratic, meritocratic, and inclusive in that it drew large numbers of women and people of color into its orbit, but it simultaneously fostered socioeconomic inequality as real wages stagnated for the U.S. working classes, a stagnation that ironically was masked by women's conscription into the labor market. So with this structural transformation in mind, it's worth revisiting the narcissism debates of the 1970s and looking at the contested place of the family within them. At the precise moment that gender relations underlay capitalism were being transformed and reimagined, Lasch and his critics, and his feminist critics in particular, offered up two contrasting accounts of the modern history of paternal authority within the family. This debate was passionate, rancorous, and at least for Lasch, deeply personal. The aim of my talk today is to outline both the Laschian and the feminist positions in order to better understand what each side got right and what each side got wrong. I also want to ask if there might be ways for us to get beyond the impasse that they themselves could not overcome. In other words, how does the debate look now, 4 decades later, at a political moment when we are reaping the neoliberal whirlwind? So let's start with Lasch. Recall that for him, the rise of narcissism as both a clinical diagnosis and a cultural condition was a direct consequence of waning paternal authority within the family over the course of the 20th century. This was the subject of Haven in a Heartless World, a book that was published 2 years before The Culture of Narcissism. In this earlier book, Lasch described the history of the modern family in ways that were akin to how one might describe the history of a colonized nation, that is, as marred by invasion, plunder, and expropriation. For Lasch, the crucial turning point was progressive era reform. Between 1900 and 1930, parental functions once confined to the private sphere had been appropriated by agents of a burgeoning welfare state, including doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, teachers, and child guidance experts. Contrary to empowering the family, Lasch argued, these members of the helping professions were shoring up their own authority and undermining the family's capacity to provide for its own needs. The consequence was twofold. First, motherhood was revamped into a professional career, eviscerating the once protected relations between mother and child. And second, the father within the family was stripped of his authority as his role was slowly whittled away to that of a breadwinner and nothing more. The Culture of Narcissism was Lasch's attempt to come to terms with the psychic repercussions of this decline in paternal authority. Rejecting the commonsensical inference that a decline in paternal authority had led to the decline of the superego, Lasch came to the opposite conclusion. In the absence of the father, the superego had instead become harsher, more archaic, and more punitive. Quote, "The changing conditions of family life do not produce a decline in the superego," wrote Lasch, "but rather an alteration of its contents," end quote. What made the father's withdrawal from the family so damaging, Lasch argued, was not simply that it had deprived the child of a necessary role model, but also that the child's infantile fantasies of an omnipotent, wrathful, and punitive father had been left largely undisturbed. As the modern father grew more and more remote, the child's archaic impressions of him could no longer be tested and revised against everyday experience. This insight was at the heart of Lasch's understanding of the narcissist. Despite the trappings of selfishness, Lasch pointed out, narcissism represented a painful form of brute survivalism in a psychic universe dictated by archaic fantasies and infantile dreads. The narcissist suffered because he lacked the emotional supplies needed to differentiate between the self and the world of objects. And it was the waning of paternal authority that had set the stage for this suffering. At the same moment that Lasch was advancing this theory of narcissism, feminists were developing a very different historical narrative about the family. While Lasch centered on the erosion of paternal authority within the family, feminists honed in on the enduring power of this same authority. They contended that historically, patriarchal authority had subordinated women and circumscribed their lives, often in devastating ways. This feminist understanding of patriarchy entailed a new conception of private life. While feminist accounts of male sexism were varied, there was consensus that women's marginalization extended beyond the formal domains of law, economy, and politics and encroached into the most intimate psychic arenas of life. Hence the feminist slogan, "The personal is political." As feminists recognized that everything from housework to childbearing to sexual relations could be suffused with political meaning, they identified the family as a primary locus of both patriarchal domination and women's oppression. And while they shared with Lasch a critique of the mid-century welfare state, their critique diverged from his. While Lasch attacked the welfare state for breeding an epidemic of fatherlessness, feminists critiqued it as androcentric, that is, for privileging men and marginalizing women in both public and private life. These insights led feminists to interrogate Lasch's vision of a fatherless society, which they did on psychological, historical, and political grounds. First, they argued that Lasch's definition of narcissism was premised on a distinctly masculine theory of psychosocial development, one that pathologized femininity. Second, they argued that by constructing a narrative of family decline from Victorianism to modernism, Lasch displayed a troubling nostalgia for the bourgeois patriarchal family and a failure to confront women's oppression within it. Finally, feminists saw Lasch within the political context of an anti-feminist backlash by the late 1970s. At a time when many conservatives were idealizing the traditional family, Lasch showed contempt for a feminist movement fighting to move forward in the face of retrenchment. According to feminist writer Vivian Gornick, the culture of narcissism exposed nothing more than Lasch's, quote, fatal lack of sympathy for the time in which he finds himself, end quote. Contrary to being an age of diminishing expectations, Gornick contended, feminist America was a vibrant world of weeds pushing through the concrete, and all that an unsympathetic Lasch could see in her estimation was breaking concrete. Lasch, meanwhile, dismissed the feminist response to his two books as hysterical. He evinced, in his words, quote, a seemingly endless capacity for misrepresentation, slander, vilification, and character assassination, end quote. So who got it right and who got it wrong? Well, there was certainly truth to the feminist charge of nostalgia. Lasch admitted as much in a letter to a colleague, writing that he felt remote, quote, from the modern world in general, the same way I always felt, only more so, end quote. This sense of remoteness from the present was a luxury that most women neither desired nor could afford. As the novelist Zadie Smith recently observed of nostalgia, time travel is a discretionary art, a pleasure trip for some and a horror show for others. Lasch's nostalgia led him to question key features of the feminist agenda, including sexual liberation and the equation of careers for women with emancipation. The breach between Lasch and his feminist interlocutors was thus not surprising. Although years later, once the dust had settled, Lasch would admit that he had been what he called extremely indebted to the feminist legacy. But the breach reflected a deeper impasse than either side realized at the time. For feminists, women's liberation was an incontrovertibly heroic movement for individual freedom. But Lasch was trying to understand feminism as one dimension of a broader historical transformation in the structure of the family. Feminists saw women's liberation as a legitimate response to the family's patriarchal structure, but Lasch was more concerned with the overall dissolution of the family, understood as the linchpin of generational continuity and as a primary source of resistance to the mordant waves of marketization. Feminists saw the advent of their movement as a revelation of the power of patriarchal structures, but Lasch believed that by the time the women's liberation movement of the 1970s had arrived, the institution that feminists identified as the source of women's oppression, the nuclear family, had already been eviscerated by market forces and state bureaucracies. Lasch got some of the particulars wrong, and his political instincts could be very off base. For example, Lasch should not have been surprised when his claim that state bureaucracies undermined family autonomy converged with that of conservatives who, especially after 1980, wanted to dismantle the welfare state. But Lasch did intuitively grasp certain dimensions of the large-scale changes that were underway by the late 1970s. He understood, earlier than most, that traditional gender hierarchies within the family were being upended as the economy shifted to a dual-earner economy. He was more right than wrong when he contended that when feminists took aim at the male-headed family, they were targeting an institution at the precise moment of its dissolution. Lasch grasped, in other words, that late capitalism was characterized not by the shoring up of paternal authority, but rather by its dissolution, or at least heightened fragility. It is no accident that some of the greatest television shows of the last decades have been extended meditations on this fragility. Here I'm thinking of Friday Night Lights, The Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, and my current favorite, Better Call Saul, I recommend. All of which offer up portraits of men under pressure within the family. Even our current pussy grabber-in-chief appears more like a buffoonish caricature of masculinity rather than a genuinely powerful patriarch, which does not diminish the pain that he has inflicted on the women in his life, and now on so many women of the electorate. Finally, Lasch was astute in recognizing that as neoliberal capitalism conscripted more women into the world of work, it would place unprecedented pressure on family life. As women flooded into the workforce, Lasch asked, what would happen to mutual support networks and intergenerational ties? What would happen to care work, or what Marxist feminists call social reproduction? The work of caring for the young, the old, and the infirm, along with all of the daily tasks, cooking, cleaning, laundry, required to sustain a household. What would happen to societal structures of authority as prolonged intergenerational conflicts within the family began to dissolve? Here, I think we can see a moment of missed opportunity for collaboration, because whatever their disagreements with Lasch, second-wave feminists were also deeply engaged with this question of social reproduction, at least at first. Indeed, this was one of the movement's signal achievements, to shed light on women's uncompensated labor within the household, child rearing, care for the young and the elderly, cooking, shopping, housework, forms of labor that historically had been unpaid, uncompensated, and invisible. In the early 1970s, many feminists insisted that these labors were a social collective responsibility. Take, for example, the case of childcare. In 1961, the New Deal activist Carolyn Ware lamented to the Commission on the Status of Women that, quote, many of the most conscientious and responsible mothers cannot adequately take care of their children because they do not have the facilities which the community should provide for that purpose, end quote. 5 years later, Now's statement of purpose called for a nationwide network of child care centers, explaining that childcare was not an individual problem, but rather a basic social dilemma which society must solve. Now's demand proceeded from the premise that the government had the resources to create such a network, and that childcare was not a private matter, but rather an arena of public interest. In 1971, Congress passed the Comprehensive Child Development Act, which called for the creation of a national child care program. Nixon vetoed it on the grounds that it advocated a communal rather than a family-centered approach to child rearing. This story, I think, tells us something significant about the feminism of the 1970s. Despite the movement's extraordinary achievements, a fundamental question about social reproduction, who would henceforth perform all of this work, remained unresolved as the nation transitioned to a dual-earner economy. And these contradictions only deepened after 1980 as attacks on the welfare state mounted, and as earlier feminist aspirations for redistributive politics morphed into a politics centered more on identity, professional advancement, and recognition. And as neoliberal logics took hold, both the state and corporations divested from social welfare. Wage stagnation compounded this crisis. After 1973, both men and women would have to work 2 jobs and sometimes more to garner the same living wage that had been available to the male breadwinner of the 1950s. The consequence is what philosopher Nancy Fraser has identified as a deep crisis in care that prevails today. The wealthy and the professional managerial classes outsource care work to low-wage workers, such as nannies and housekeepers, but for virtually everyone else, that option is not available, and the pressures on families and communities are only getting worse, creating the scenes of despair that garnered so much media attention in the immediate wake of the election. Lasch, I think, saw this crisis coming. Consider this passage from his 1978 preface to Haven in a Heartless World. Quote, "The most important indictment of the present organization of work is that it forces women to choose between their desire for economic self-sufficiency and the needs of her children. Instead of blaming the family for the state of affairs, we should blame the relentless demands of the job market itself. Instead of asking how women can be liberated from the family, we should ask how work can be reorganized, humanized, so as to make it possible for women to compete economically with men without sacrificing their families or even the very hope of a family. Those who endorse the goals of the women's movement need to look beyond the existing organization of work and beyond feminism to a new set of social arrangements in which work becomes itself another aspect of nurture, transcends its present character of individual self-aggrandizement, and comes to serve the needs, not merely of the living, but of generations yet to come," end quote. This brings us back finally to Lasch and his feminist critics. At the moment that neoliberalism took hold, both sides recognized that the family was deeply embedded within the structure of capitalism. The feminist movement caught one side of this. Historically, a capitalist patriarchal system had relied on women's unpaid labor within the home. Lasch caught the other side, the erosion of paternal authority throughout the society as the dual-earner family supplanted the breadwinner ideal. In the late 1970s, they got stuck at an impasse. But can we move beyond it, knowing what we now know about the history of late capitalism over the last 4 decades? A shared commitment among both men and women to an ethic of care might contribute. Both the Laschian and the feminist outlooks envisioned a society that measured its strength by its capacity to protect its most vulnerable members, children, the elderly, the poor, and the sick, and to create networks of care within both the home and the workplace that could be transmitted from one generation to the next. Feminists were certainly right when they took Lasch to task for nostalgia and anti-feminism, but Lasch was right that feminism alone would be inadequate to the political task at hand. Thank you.
Hello. I want to talk with you today about the reception of ideas. Can you hear me? Is the mic on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Hold it.
I'm to my mouth.
Yes.
It's much higher than Natasha's or Liz's. Because I've got the legs in the way. Okay. Thank you. Is this better?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to talk about something unusual, which is the transportation of Christopher Lasch's ideas into the German-speaking lands in the 1970s and 1980s. So the reception of ideas about narcissism. And I'm going to focus on West Germany and neighboring Switzerland, where there's a lot of border crossing in particular. So I'm going to talk about the reception of the notions promoted in Lasch's Culture of Narcissism, which appeared in German already in 1980, as well as the reception of ideas put forward by the 2 main psychoanalytic experts on narcissism, Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg, right? Both were Viennese, but at that Viennese origin, but US-based, on whose work Lasch relied, but which he also respun for his own purposes. And then finally, in a very brief coda, I want to share with you some unexpected uses to which Heinz Kohut's work in particular could be put. But first, in order to clarify the background, I need to tell you a bit about the extraordinary difficulties involved in returning psychoanalysis to, after all, still strongly anti-Semitic post-Nazi West Germany. So here's the sequence. Psychoanalysis returns to Central Europe, to the reception of Lasch, Kohut, and Kernberg in West Germany and neighboring parts of Switzerland. And the short version is that Kohut's reception, Kohut is the self-psychologist, right? Kohut's reception was initially positive, but it was wrecked, both because of the ways he got tangled up in the pop cultural chatter about Lasch, and because of problems in his own self-presentation. And ultimately, Kernberg emerged as the winner in his rivalry with Kohut, not least because his ideas seemed more suited to making sense of life in a post-Nazi nation, and more suited to dealing with difficult patients. And then third, despite the turn against Kohut, especially among younger, new left-leaning German and Swiss analysts, there was one prominent radical Swiss analyst, a man named Fritz Morgenthaler, who was a member of the International Psychoanalytical Association and a major mentor figure to younger anti-fascist new leftists in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Italy, who was in close, empathic but critical dialogue with Kohut, and who found Kohut's self-psychological ideas about narcissism clinically highly useful, even as he gave them a sex-radical twist, completely at odds with Kohut's more sexually conservative approach. So you can tell it's going to be intricate, but I'll do my best to be clear. So, very first thing is, part one, it was not easy to return psychoanalysis to post-Nazi Germany, a land in which it had been derided as sex-obsessed, filthy, and Jewish. So this is from 1933, this cartoon, The Role of the Jew in Medicine, the Psychoanalysis of the Jew, Sigmund Freud, and it has a cartoon which has a stereotypically unattractive Jewish man, doctor, dealing with a non-Jewish woman patient. And she's having headaches, and he tells her to lie down and start to free associate, as analysts do. And she has a string of thoughts, and then she's thinking this and that, and then she says, "Dolch," which is like a dagger. And he goes, "Ah, I know what's wrong. You're sexually unhappy in your marriage. I know how to heal you, lie down." So you get the general idea that this is the kind of trashy, dirty sex that Jewishness and psychoanalysis were associated with. That was very strongly that opinion was very strongly permeated in Germany. It took a lot of effort to have a different idea about psychoanalysis being brought back in the post-Nazi period. Crucial figures were the Frankfurt School philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer, who worked very hard to awaken interest, organizing a lecture series that brought emigrant analysts back to Germany in 1956, and also helping to forward the efforts of Alexander Mitscherlich, the German Gentile ego psychologist who was to become the major face of psychoanalysis in West Germany in the 60s and 70s. And you probably know him from this book, The Inability to Mourn, which was later published in 67 and then in 75 in the US. And it's not about the inability to mourn the murdered Jews of Europe, but rather the inability of the German public to mourn its own erstwhile love of Adolf Hitler. Also, the liberal news magazine Der Spiegel, it's like the Time or Newsweek of Germany, tried to get the public interested when it ran a cover story on Freud in '59. But as late as 1964, Horkheimer was admitting to the New York Times that the German public was not really very interested in psychoanalysis. That was soon to change, but for an unexpected reason. The publication, first in Austria in 1963, and then in the US and UK in '66, of the animal behavior specialist Konrad Lorenz's best-selling book on aggression. Lorenz's animal stories were often cutesy, but actually quite insidious. In On Aggression, he invoked Freud on the very first page, and with the book he set in motion a fierce nationwide debate in West Germany over whether aggression in the human animal was simply natural and inevitable, and even a positive. In other words, it's not a German specialty, everybody does it, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. And also specifically over what exactly Freud had initially meant when he suggested that aggression might be a drive, sleep, right, comparable in strength and form to libido. And while Lorenz strenuously denied having been a Nazi, when he won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his animal research, his former Nazi Party membership came out, and so did ugly things he wrote during the Third Reich about the domestication of humans and about needing to, quote, eradicate the unhealthy and disabled. So it was ironically an ex-Nazi who set in motion the conversation that brought psychoanalysis back to post-Nazi Germany. Importantly, although his Nazi past had not been known during the years of the biggest disputes over his arguments, the anti-Vietnam War New Left intuitively loathed Lawrence and contested his theories that aggression was inevitable in the human animal, offering instead, this is very funny, it's counterintuitive for Americans, a mixture of sex-friendly Marxist analyst Wilhelm Reich and the frustration aggression theorist John Dollard, as they also, countering Lawrence's version of Freud, resuscitated an explicitly sex-radical version of Freud himself. While their left-liberal ego-psychologist elder, Alexander Mitscherlich, who also loathed Lawrence, quite personally, loathed him, offered a more balanced assessment of Freud, not least in the IPA in Vienna in 1971. On the one hand, declaring that Freud had taught him that, quote, aggression is a fundamental force of life. In other words, aggression is pervasive in the human animal. But on the other hand, also noting that wars and injustice were not inevitable, but always had their triggering source in social forces, and, as Mitscherlich put it, in man-made stupidity. Der Spiegel, like numerous other media venues, followed and disseminated the disputes about Lawrence avidly, ultimately thereby also shifting its own presentation of Freud, who you can see here in 1968 on the left, it's still put in a new left-inspired sex-happy lineage with, of all people, Alfred Kinsey and Masters and Johnson, to very same photograph. By 1971, only 3 years later, a far more downbeat, culturally conservative, aggression-focused version. But the upshot was that many, many more West Germans started to read Freud directly to figure out what exactly he might have said. That, together with the ongoing and urgent new left interest in Freud, which is overdetermined reasons, right? These are all people who are now in their 70s or 80s themselves, but basically desiring to make sense of their parents' attractions to fascism, working to recover the radical Jewish inheritance of the early 20th century that had been destroyed by the Nazis, and seeing Freud as part of that radical heritage, but also trying to make sense of their own unhappiness as the political revolution they'd hoped to make was defeated. All of that new left interest secured the, to this day, durable return of psychoanalysis to post-Nazi Germany. I mean, the short version would be psychoanalysis acquired, not least due to Mitscherlich's leadership and to new left enthusiasm, far more prestige in Germany than it ever had in Freud's own day. Part 2. However, this first time-delayed and then compressed German language engagement with psychoanalysis in the later 60s and early 70s made for some peculiarities in the reception of ideas coming from the US and the UK. Specifically, as a Gentile German, it was incumbent upon Mitscherlich to loyally take his cues from the forms of psychoanalysis endorsed by Sigmund Freud's daughter Anna and her closest associates in the US, which were Heinz Hartmann and his colleagues. And hence, for example, also to keep his distance from Anna Freud's main British rival, Melanie Klein. So this is a main reason for the extraordinary time lag in the reception of Klein in Germany. Yet Mitscherlich was also one of the closest friends in the German-speaking lands with the renegade Chicago-based former ego-psychologist and soon-to-be inventor of self-psychology, Heinz Kohut. So there's Kohut on the left and Mitscherlich with the glasses in the middle. The other close friend was the Swiss Fritz Morgenthaler, who Mitscherlich too knew well. Mitscherlich, by giving Kohut a venue in his journal Psyche, which is the major psychoanalytic journal in Germany, and Morgenthaler, by promoting among his trainees, this is Morgenthaler, the Swiss guy, by promoting among his trainees and mentees Kohut's clinical ideas about how better to work with patients with narcissistic personality disorders, were central figures in the dissemination of Kohut and in psychoanalytic interest in problems of narcissism. For example, when Kohut met with severe criticism from other analysts at the IPA Congress in Paris in 1973, feeling hurt and misunderstood and outshone by his rival, the borderline specialist Otto Krimberg, it was Morgenthaler who stepped in to defend Kohut and explain his ideas convincingly to their peers. But in order to understand how Kohut was read on the European side of the Atlantic, we have to grasp how intense was the time compression in the only so recently renewed reception of psychoanalysis in Central Europe. So developments that had taken place over a full quarter century in the US, right, ego psychology in the immediate post-war period, 20 years later we get COHUT, actually arrived in West Germany all within the same year. Right? They're reading Hartmann and COHUT side by side in the midst of the New Left revolt. Significantly, in short, COHUT re-arrived in Central Europe 10 years before Christopher Lasch did, right? So COHUT is being avidly received 69, 70 at the height of interest in psychoanalysis in the New Left, 10 years before the Lasch thing. Indeed, discussion of narcissism was in the air also for purposes of general cultural diagnosis long before Lasch arrived. So, for instance, just to give one of a gazillion examples, already in 75, building expressly on COHUT, the young education scholar Thomas Ziehe wrote a much-discussed book on, quote, puberty and narcissism, are the youth depoliticized? When Lasch was being reviewed then, and this is taken from two major reviews of Lasch when his book came out in German, it was in a climate in which the collapse of the New Left and the turn to private self-improvement, you can see Carter doing his jogging, somebody going to a guru for meditation, and so on, or to self-image promotion and celebrity politics, you see Kissinger there. In other words, these are very conventional understandings of narcissism, not psychoanalytic ones. All of that discussion was already on the agenda. Even as simultaneously, German reviewers grasped full well that one of the sources from which Lasch had drawn was the perception among analysts that their patient base was shifting from one consumed by edible challenges and neuroses to narcissistic personality disorders. Lasch, COHUT, and Kernberg all showed up, for example, in eminent philosopher Jürgen Habermas's 1981 magnum opus, The Theory of Communicative Action. COHUT in particular was singled out there as evidence for the shift in modal personalities and the declining significance of edible problematics. I mean, Germans are all up to speed on this. They're taking this incredibly seriously. The effects for COHUT of all this were contradictory. COHUT himself played into the extrapolation from individual patients to a culture-wide diagnosis. And while German language commentators vacillated, I would say there were sort of three directions in the reception of Lasch in Germany. One is a feeling of superiority, this is typical German, to what Lasch sees as the vacuity of American culture, like, oh, well, those Americans, of course, they're empty. Two, a sense that Lasch's diagnosis might apply to Germany also, and in fact, dozens of analysts at the time decided suddenly that they'd misdiagnosed their own patients and their own society as neurotic, when really they were all narcissistically disturbed. And many of you may remember Alice Miller's The Drama of the Gifted Child, right? She's a Swiss Zurich-based person. She was definitely COHUT inspired, and again, another one who's responsible for the certain kind of reception of these ideas in German-speaking lands. Or I would say the third trend was kind of a flat-out rejection of the diagnosis as inapplicable to individuals or to culture. But in general, it's obvious is that everybody's talking about it, and there's no question that the reception of COHUT, although he's been there for 10 years already in the culture of discussions, got thoroughly snarled up with the wider debate over whether narcissism was a culture-wide problem and what to make of Christopher Lasch. Moreover, and although COHUT vigorously objected to any reduction of his work to some sort of simplistic encouragement to be more empathic with patients, there's no question that also in the US, one of the reasons for COHUT's initial popularity was that he was almost a permission giver in the face of what had been quite stringent, emotionally withholding ego psychology a la Hartmann. So while German and Swiss analysts had initially taken up with great interest COHUT's ideas about pre-Oedipal damages, grandiose selves, parental imagos, and about how to recognize a narcissistic disturbance by the type of transference a patient manifested, they were also put off by COHUT's own self-promotion, as well as by the uncritically adoring hype about him put out by such loyal Cohutians as, for example, Paul Ornstein. Eventually, it was to be Otto Kernberg's more Melanie Klein-inspired view of human nature that came to appear far more true to the post-Nazi German experience. Kernberg's Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism had already been making the rounds in German translation in 1978. A couple years later, a young West German analyst reported on how Kernberg and Kohut were being received in Germany and, albeit hesitantly, being integrated into prior frameworks. By 1985, the magisterial newspaper Die Zeit, it's a weekly, but it sort of has the austere authority of the New York Times, commented that also literature scholars had learned to slip the words narcissism and borderline into their conversation, and, quote, it has become de rigueur to invoke Kernberg and Kohut. By 1986, however, Die Zeit was using Kernberg to critique Kohut, noting that, quote, in the final analysis he, Kohut, has called into question the entire concept of the drives. He neglects the negative transference. He has a supportive, re-educative approach. Citing Kernberg's darker vision of human nature, the paper affirmatively quoted his critical jab, quote, Kohut sees aggression only as a reaction to frustrating experiences and does not see that cruelty and sadism can also give pleasure. Or, as the Swiss analyst Emilio Modena noted in 1981 in an anthology critical of Kohut, this is the entire thing is a big attack on Kohut, he far preferred Kernberg's interpretive confrontational style to Kohut's mirroring supportive one. And other young Swiss and Germans also remarked disapprovingly on what they took to be Kohut's banality. All of this occurred in a wider, we're in the 80s now, right? In a wider but then intensive engagement with Kleinianism. And especially the British Kleinians, Herbert Rosenfeld and Hannah Siegel, were incredibly important suddenly for younger Germans and Swiss. So what happens is that British Kleinians come to do workshops in Germany, and all kinds of younger Germans, analysts in training, go to England in order to get supervision. The same unresolved, distinctively post-Nazi preoccupation with the nature of human aggression drove this interest in Klein. But so too did concrete struggles with particularly recalcitrant patients. As one German analyst recently remembered, quote, Herbert Rosenfeld, conveyed as a German-speaking Kleinian supervisor from London, and he was an emigre, right, he fled the Nazis, a concrete clinical access to the patient, one that also incorporated an awareness of and a taking seriously of the destructive elements in transference and countertransference. But this person also remembered that Rosenfeld facilitated, quote, reflections on elements of Nazi mass psychology. So the 80s are an extraordinary moment in reflecting back on the legacies of Nazism within Germany. Already by the second half of the 80s, observers were commenting with concern that the new enthusiasm for Klein in West Germany might have unacknowledged mixed motives. Quote, what is noticeable is that for a couple of years now, we can see a practically inflationary use of Kleinian terminology, like splitting, projection, projective identification, etc. This late discovery of Klein coincides in time with the discussion of psychoanalysis about the National Socialist era. The authors were a bit skeptical about this newly pervasive injunctions for everyone to, quote, get in touch with their own psychotic kernels. That was the slogan of the time, as obvious as it was that these often had to do with the, quote, unworked through Nazi past. And they worried that faddish developments can, after all, be a form of collective defense. Nonetheless, this is the context in which Kernberg ascended. Part 3, super brief, 3 minutes. One individual, however, stuck with Kohut, even as he argued with him. Already in 1969, at the IPA Congress in Rome, Fritz Morgenthaler had taken up Kohut's idea that the therapist might serve as a function for the patient, a part of the self, rather than a transferential object. Throughout the 70s, he tirelessly explicated Kohut's innovations in seminars and lectures, and used not only Kohut's therapeutic proposals, but also his concept of early traumatic disturbances in the development of the self in order to formulate a unique, but ultimately very influential theory of perversions as attempts to heal a rift within the self. Kohut and Morgenthaler were in those years in regular correspondence, even as Morgenthaler was himself in transformation and steadily developing more radical conceptions of sexuality. And another subplot, as Morgenthaler also pursued anthropological and psychoanalytic fieldwork, first in Africa with the Dogon in Mali and the Anyin Ivory Coast, and then in Papua New Guinea. Notably, moreover, Morgenthaler idiosyncratically but significantly retained a commitment to ego psychology and to the idea of the drives, alongside his intrigue engagement with Kohut and self-psychology. But what Morgenthaler drew from Kohut's books, but with a sex-affirmative twist, was that what might seem at first glance to be a sexual matter, a perversion, was actually better understood as a sexualized attempt to solve a more primal existential issue. In other words, what looks sexual can have non-sexual sources. Bringing it all together in a major 1974 essay, Morgenthaler's main concluding notion, inspired by Kohut, was that a perversion or an orientation, like any symptom, fulfilled a function. Indeed, it was a function. The analyst's task was to honor and work with and around it rather than to combat it, and to help the patient develop a more flexible and expanded self. This essay caught the eye of gay rights activists and sexologists, urgently working to reduce homophobia in post-Nazi West Germany, one of whom invited Morgenthaler to write the entry on homosexuality for a major sex therapy anthology. And Morgenthaler did this, and also published short versions of that essay about homosexuality in 1979 in the mainstream and the gay press. This is the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. It's one of the most prominent newspapers in Switzerland. And in this process, garnering for himself the deserved reputation as the first European analyst of any nationality, since Freud, to declare that homosexuality was not a pathology. Morgenthaler was no simple theorist of emancipation. He's not a Willem Brandtjian or anything, even as he developed lovely ideas about the sexual as a guerrilla force in always uneven battle with the dictatorship that was already formed sexuality. But the point remains that this first European analyst to reject homophobia outright, and by this means to help roll back one of the most damaging legacies of Nazism, drew inspiration from Kohut's work on narcissism. Thank you.